All right, we're going live on YouTube with Sunday Night School. I think it's been almost 2 months of going through these now. And for the month of October, we're focusing on the question of polyamory and the Bible. The first part of this series, we went through the book of Romans and chapter 14, just looking at the question of how do we navigate whatever it is that we happen to find as Christians. And I think that provides an excellent foundation. If you haven't seen it yet, I will highly recommend going there and seeing how that speaks to you. I think it's the shortest one of these studies so far, and absolutely incredible. I'm going to refresh my YouTube broadcast screen here. Sometimes it shows up funny at the beginning. Here we are. All right, so we are live. Night number 2 of polyamory in the Bible was last week. So I guess this might actually just be number 3. So part 3, we're going to be looking at a question that comes from the famous passage in Hebrews, let the marriage bed be undefiled. And as always, with a Sunday night school, I'm not coming into this having done a previous study. I was debating between going this direction tonight and going the direction of looking at adultery in the Old Testament and the difference between expectations for men and expectations for women. Now, if you're really curious about that, I will highly recommend all these high recommendations today, but I just got my book this week. So if you go to Amazon, you can get a print copy of this. And I deal with a lot of that question. Let me see if I can find the chapter. In chapter 16, it's a chapter titled Adultery, and it points out and it really dives into the question of, like you can see just part of the chapter here, power dynamics, exclusivity, breaking of covenant, the concept of virginity. And I think we'll go through a little bit of that next week. The question that I want to explore when we go through that is something I don't cover in my book. So if you're curious about it, be sure to join live, because I want to open our live session with a chance for you to ask any kind of questions that might be on your mind, any kind of curiosity, things that have been raised so far. The purpose of Sunday night school is for connecting with other people in Bible study. That's partly why this is live. The other reason to show up, at least this month, is that I'm working on a project on polyamory and the Bible. I think this is a question that we're going to have to wrestle with as Christians. It's going to meet the church community really strongly here in the next couple of years. And I want us to be equipped to have a better answer to it than we've had to all kinds of other questions about sex. So far, Christian response is standard. It is one man, one woman for life, or whatever you want. Kind of 2 separate options. And I don't think that you find either of those in the Bible. If you have no idea about what I'm saying, that's where you should go check out my book. Go to sacrednotsinful.com. You can read a little bit more about my background, the story that brought this book together, the reasons why I decided to write it, and I'll even be sharing a little bit about why it is so hard for me to be having these conversations. Because when it comes to ethical questions, it's so much easier to start with an assumption that one large group of society already accepts. What is more difficult is to do this approach that we're trying to take here in this video, and that is to approach the Bible with openness and curiosity to discover what it has to say about a topic. We're not trying to force it to say you can only have sex with one other person your whole life, and you should be married to them and they should be of the opposite gender. And we're not also trying to find permission to do whatever we want. Though I do think it's possible to construct an argument for both of those things from the scripture. It just depends on which passages you look at, how you put them in relationship to each other. And this is what makes Bible study so complicated sometimes. It's also the reason why Sunday night school is here to help you develop some of the tools that you need to study for yourself, to understand what it is that teachers are doing when they bring you the text, to be able to ask good questions and to discern this idea of constant practice, to discern good from evil. This is another verse from Hebrews. All right, this is definitely the passage for tonight. You can find this on my website, drkevinjensen.com. It is the purpose behind my teaching work. As an educator who moved into sex education and Christian ethics, it's really valuable for me that you develop the skills that you need to do this kind of study and discovery for yourself. So again, if you're here live and you have any questions or want me to go deeper in any direction at some point, feel free to drop something in the chat. I will be checking back here from time to time to see what's there. Otherwise, if you're catching this live stream after it's finished, feel free to reach out with any kinds of questions, concerns, whatever it's raising for you. I'm here to help you navigate these questions of sex, gender, and relationships. So to get started tonight, I want to share my screen. Let me pull this up. And I don't even have the passage pulled up yet, but let's do a search. I already know it's going to be Hebrews, but let's just type in marriage bed, because I want to know if this phrase comes up in more places or if it's just in Hebrews. If you've had any conversations about polyamory with a Christian, I'm guessing at some point in time, they came up with this verse, Hebrews 13:4. I want to open this in context. So we'll click on this. If you don't have a Bible to study with at home, the Blue Letter Bible is great to use online. And I've also discovered it works really well in their phone app as well. If you pull this up, you're able to do things like this. Do you see how we can move from the verse into the Greek words? So we're talking about marriage. And we haven't got anything of this context. I'm just going to go right into the verse and see what is it that the verse is talking about. I'm influenced this way from a blog post that I read this week, which was very interesting. I was diving more deeply into the question of porneia and moikeia, I believe is how you say this word, and the relationship between the two of them. You see pornos and moikos. These are the two Greek words used here. Now, fornicators is an unfortunate translation of this word. If you have never heard me say that before, you need to go back and watch what I think is the oldest one of my YouTube videos, where I present my research on the rhetorical meaning of porneia throughout the New Testament. The teaching that I came across recently, though, was very interesting, because what they said is the reason fornicators and adulterers often showed up together in the New Testament is that fornicators was more referring to men and adulterers to women, because if we've talked about this, where the meaning of adultery meant to have sex with a woman who belonged to another man. It had everything to do with the woman's marital status. And so typically they would call the woman an adulteress if she had sex with somebody besides the man she was married to. That's what adultery meant through the Old Testament. The New Testament is interesting because it's shifting somewhat. The way the New Testament talks about these things is different from the way they're talked about in the Old Testament. And porneia, at least in this article, was applied more to, here is a man who is, for him, adultery for the man meant being unfaithful to his wife by sending her away, by not caring for her, by not loving her. For the woman, unfaithful meant she had sex with another man. So a guy could have sex with anybody he wanted to, unless she belonged to another man. That wouldn't make him an adulterer. And so this is why they brought in the word fornicators to say, and again, Fornicators is a bad translation of this word, but the people who commit porneia, or whose sexual behavior is not aligned with who they're called to be as a Christian, would be referring to the men, saying, of course, socially speaking, you have permission to have sex with a number of people without committing adultery. It wouldn't be considered that. But it may be considered porneia if you are letting your sexual desire drive your behavior in ways that are not loving to your partner. Now, I think this may be one of the most important considerations for us in our discussion of polyamory and the Bible, is that as Christians, the highest call for us to remember is to love God with every part of our lives, especially our sexuality. That is ultimately the case that I make in the book, Sacred, Not Sinful. Secondly, is to love others, because this, how we relate to each other, is how we relate to God. We see this connection, is that the way we treat each other is the way that we treat God. Because we as human beings are sacred creatures made in the image of God. What we do to each other, we do to God. To paraphrase Jesus, what you have done for the least of these, you have done for me. There's not this divide like, oh, you're only human and I'll be nice to God. You can't make that split. The book of 1 John is your best friend if you want to know more about that. So that's why I wanted to dive into this verse directly, because I was curious to see this connection between pornos and moikos. God will judge. And God is the one who decides whether or not it's adultery or porneia. Not us. God is the one who decides. It's quite interesting, right? I think a lot of us forget that part. We're like, God will judge, which means he uses the standards that I have about what would work and what would not work. And here is where I'm going to touch on the question a little bit more, even more than I had intended. Because in a lot of relationships, people have different standards for how comfortable they are with their partner engaging and interacting with other people. I know some who are like, well, you can't be friends with a person that you might potentially have a sexual relationship or sexual attraction to. They cannot even handle you having a conversation with them. Some people, it's like, well, don't go on dates with them. Some people, it's like, well, don't have unprotected sex with them. There are different standards in different kinds of relationships. And ultimately, God is the one who judges when there has been adultery, which if you want to look more into that, we'll talk about that next week. And it's all about the breaking of covenant and relationship, or porneia, which is about a violation of your integrity as a Christian. What does that look like? It's not quite as simple as saying, here's a list of the 5 things that you can do that violate your integrity. Anything could. And as we saw from Romans 14, if you think something is a sin, it is a sin for you to do that. Does that work in the opposite direction? To the pure, all things are pure. Does that include things that most of us might judge as impure? We had to wrestle with this in 1 Corinthians 5. I think that was 2 weeks ago. We accidentally bumped into the questions about incest, because the Corinthian church was saying, hey, it's all right to celebrate this. And Paul said, you all are an embarrassment. You need to quit this. This is awful. You need to cast this person out of your community, because this is, whatever he was doing was porneia. Not because what he was doing was one of 5 prohibited things, but because what he was doing did not reflect who he was called to be. I think there's even more to it than that. I wasn't focused specifically on this question when we went through that passage. We went all the way back to the Old Testament and asked the question about incest, because there were a whole lot of examples of that throughout the Old Testament. And how do we respond to that? The reason why I chose to start with this verse is because this idea of being defiled is something I want to go into a little bit more. Because last week we discussed the idea of Reuben having sex with his father's concubine and how that was considered to be defiling something. We also looked at the idea of David and his concubines who he left behind, and how Absalom went and had sex with them, and how David would never touch them again after that, or let anybody else touch them for that matter. Now, these were sex slaves, at least insofar as we were able to uncover. Why wouldn't he touch them again? What had happened? Was it simply a bad memory? Was there something physically going on? Was there a spiritual reality that they were dancing with? That is what I hope to discover a little bit more of tonight. So we have this idea, first of all, of marriage is to be held in honor among all. It's important to think about this in the context of that day. Right? Anytime we're studying a passage, we need to understand a little bit more about what is going on during this time period. And that is why I actually do a lot of reading of books like this, which is some brilliant research on the Greek cultural paradigm, the Hebrew cultural paradigm, and what is going on in the culture of that day. Why would the Hebrews try to have a different sexual standard than people who were not Hebrew? How do we, and like this is the book of Hebrews again, and so there were certain distinctions made. One of the major distinctions of that time was that people would be circumcised. This is why it was a discussion in the early church. Does circumcision, is it necessary for you to be a follower of Jesus or not? Eventually they decided, or not. You don't have to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. You know, thankfully, that's how they decided. On what basis did they decide this? Now, that is very interesting, you know, to go in and look at the logic of how they decided to change something that has been an established tradition since the days of Abraham, mind you. It's not since the days of Moses. Circumcision was an Abrahamic tradition, which means Christianity must extend beyond the promise to Abraham. It's kind of an interesting thought, but I'm theologically nerding out. In this culture, marriage was not held in honor by all. And in fact, if we remember, let's go here. 1 Corinthians 7, marriage was actually an insult here, right? He's like, all of this, 1 Corinthians 7, 1-5, is you people have no self-control. And self-control is the opposite of porneia, this idea of integrity, of intentionally using your sexuality instead of being used by your sexual desires. And so he's like, you all have no self-control, therefore get married. Marriage is an insult in this passage, which is kind of like, all right, get married because you can't do this thing that's a fruit of the Spirit. You're failing at this. Not, this should be our standard. This is really, I came upon this inversion just last week, and I was like, this is so interesting, right? Because Paul is not saying it's better for people to get married. This is such a beautiful institution. He's saying, you all are being sexually immoral. You all are practicing porneia, which means your sexual desires are leading you to things that are terrible, that even the heathens don't tolerate. Therefore, you all need to get a husband and a wife to keep you from getting into trouble. Doesn't sound like, here, let me lay out for you God's vision for what sexual relationships ought to look like. So that's an insult. And in the culture of that day, marriage was often looked down upon in terms of being a very spiritual person. It was considered a temporary thing. And Paul even writes about this. He's like, I wish everybody was not married. And so if Paul is the one writing the letter of Hebrews, this is an important counterpart to his teaching that it's more important to be focusing your life on the kingdom of God than it is to be focusing on your marriage, because marriage puts your focus on serving another person. That is how you love God, is through loving your partner. So this is important. Let marriage be held in honor by all. Now, let's look at this. Oh my goodness. What an interesting context. I don't know if you remember us looking, we briefly touched on Sodom and Gomorrah. We touched on Judges and how showing hospitality was such an important value in the Old Testament, to the point where people would give their children to be violated by terrible people in communities so that their guests would not be. Examples of entertaining angels, Lot. Hospitality to strangers. Reference to Sodom and Gomorrah right here. Very interesting. So remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. Now this body, I wonder which word this one is, because we have two key words for body when it comes to Greek. And soma tends to be more the physical body or a community of people, which is very interesting. It tends to be like you all are physical, and it also is used metaphorically for the church community. We saw the same language in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and I'm going to have to do some more study to bring this connection. Those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. He's saying you're not just spiritual people. And again, I don't know who the author is of Hebrews, but very interesting book. Let marriage be held in honor by all. So that's the first phrase. This is a whole list of instructions. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. So we can confidently say this: remember your leaders. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings. For it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods. That's very interesting. Which have not benefited those devoted to them. What? Sorry, I'm curious. And if at any point you're curious about something, we can drop into it. I wonder if foods means something else. Broma, meat, victuals, ceremonial articles. Interesting. So he could be referring to food laws and cleanliness. We have an altar. Interesting. Like this is, it seems like the author is doing a literary transition here. And this is why it can take hours to study a single verse or a single passage. It was amazing. I was teaching earlier, and it took us like 15 minutes to get through 3 or 4 key verses in the parable of the prodigal son. So here we come, and we're just in a list of things this teacher is saying, do this, do this, do that. Let's look at the previous chapter and see what it's talking about. Do not grow weary in faith, strengthen. So we're already starting this whole list. We're talking about the kingdom and who God is. So here you have received this kingdom that cannot be shaken. It's something that is different than the kingdom of this world. So then we move into the next chapter where a whole list of things randomly drops this verse in here, which seems to be the cornerstone of polyamory teachings for pretty much everybody who I've heard talk about it. And just a random verse in this list. If you see a commonality among this and you're watching later, please drop a comment, and I'd love to know what you see here that ties all of these things together, because it's not immediately apparent to me. So the context is not helping a whole lot when it comes to understanding why this is happening. So there's 2 separate things going on here. Let marriage be held in honor, even though in some cases it seems slightly dishonorable. It's a confession of lacking self-control. And let the marriage bed be undefiled. We've discussed why these things will happen. For God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. I'm curious as to whether this phrase, and one day I'll study enough Greek to know this, applies to marriage bed be undefiled or to marriage held in honor by all. Now, honor can be placed probably in contrast with defiled, precious, most precious, dear, honorable, had in reputation, esteemed. Marriage is a beautiful thing. And let's just see some other examples of what is honorable. Okay. Precious blood of Christ, precious fruit of the earth. So, precious stones. This is to give us some idea of what this word for honor means. This means it's something that is incredibly valuable. Marriage is valuable. And let the marriage bed be undefiled. Let's go back to that. Among all. Which means all things, all people. Okay. I'm kind of curious about this word all showing up here. As in, how would I say this? Because the word is held as precious, or perhaps the word sacred is not held as holy, it's held to be honorable, something that's valuable. So let my tea collection be valued by all. Does that mean that I need to share that with everyone so they can honor that? Does that mean that everyone should think it is important? I'm kind of trying to see if I can grab an analogy to understand this. So this is marriage, particularly gamos. Let's see. Marriage, wedding, matrimony. This is where we get the word monogamy from. It has to do with one marriage. Polygamy, many marriage. When we're talking about polyamory, we're not necessarily talking about multiple marriages. We're talking about multiple loves. And for some people, you need to understand that not everybody who is polyamorous practices this in a sexual way. And it's important to note this distinction, like this idea between, the word isn't really used, but like polysexual and polyamorous and polygamous. Polygamous means you marry many people. Polyamorous means you love many people. Polysexual, which is not really a word in use, would mean you have sex with many people. These are three kind of different things that we're talking about. Here, this idea of what is precious is marriage, weddings. This relates to adultery, and it also seems to porneia, because that comes in the next part of the verse. So the next piece is the marriage bed, and I'm curious where this comes into play. I think we saw it in the story of Jacob and Reuben. I'm not sure where else we might see it. So this word, very interesting. You see the other ways this has been translated as chambering, conceive, and bed. A place for lying down, a marriage bed, of adultery, cohabitation. I wonder how they got that. Probably from chambering. Couch, by extension, by implication, the male sperm. Why? I'm kind of curious how they got that. Place for lying down or resting. And then we have this idea of cohabitation coming from, very interesting. Yep. So the word for bed is coming up in Leviticus chapter 15. And this is where we're going to have to go in order to understand defiled and undefiled, because that is related to this idea of clean and unclean. The primary things that clean and unclean show up to describe in the Old Testament are foods, which we've already peeked at just a little bit, bodily fluids, That's the other thing that can make you clean or unclean, what you eat and what comes out of you. Jesus was clear that what you eat does not defile you. That was no longer the case in his opinion. What comes out of a person does defile the person. Now that's interesting because now he's referring to something like what shows up here in Leviticus 15. Every bed whereon the person lies who has the issue is unclean. Some people think that Leviticus 15 is actually a discussion of sexually transmitted diseases because the issues that it describes are genital issues. Sorry to be so graphic, but this is in fact what the book is talking about. And so it makes sense if the book of Leviticus has all of these medical things in it, it would say, okay, if somebody has sat on a bed with an infectious disease, every bed whereon he lies who has the issue is unclean. And so somebody else who sits on that is now unclean or infected with that disease. Context, Leviticus 15, again, here's where it gets weird though, because Leviticus also includes the same idea of unclean for anyone who comes in contact with menstrual blood, right? Now, we don't consider menstrual blood to be infectious today. It is blood, so it is potentially infectious, right? And, you know, maybe having said that, maybe that's the whole reason why if a man lies with her at all and her flowers be upon him, he shall be unclean 7 days. The translation, oh my gosh. And the bed whereon he lies will be unclean. So there's this way of making the bed unclean. And it's made unclean by specific bodily fluids, at least from Leviticus, right? So we're trying to understand what is coming in when we're talking about the marriage bed being defiled or made unclean. What is it potentially talking about? And here in this Greek lexicon, we're already getting some very interesting connections. The word also comes in the Book of Wisdom. It looks like in Euripides, so some non-biblical texts. Plural could mean sexual intercourse. Let's see if we can pull that word out here. From koite, you get, this does not seem to be related, peripateo, to walk. I don't think that linked in properly. The plural of korte would be this. Chambering, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. Romans 13:13, let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. Okay. And then it also means to have conceived by a man in Romans 9:10. Not only this, when Rebecca also had conceived by one. It's very interesting, that phrasing, isn't it? She had conceived by one, even by Isaac. So it was important to know who she had been impregnated by. And this will tie into our discussion next week about this imbalance of male and female laws when it came to things like adultery or virginity or extramarital sex throughout the Old Testament. Women, it was very important to know who had fathered the child. It's very clear who mothers the child, but the father is not clear unless there's only one person who she has sex with. And that's what this is referring to. Very interesting. And then we're back to Leviticus 15. So semen also makes somebody unclean, has to be washed, but only unclean till the evening. In contrast with menstrual blood, where you're unclean for 7 days, right? Again, we have this imbalance. We also have something about blood, which I'm hoping by the end of the study, I'll be able to get into a little bit more deeply, because there is a deep misunderstanding of the power of blood, which was more fully understood by people who had to offer animal sacrifices. There's something about life and blood that are connected, and that comes in with the idea of holiness and cleansing and sacredness and clean and unclean. This here, leprosy, a running issue, shall not eat of any holy things until he be clean. So if something is defiled or unclean, it cannot enter the holy place. Whoso touches anything that is unclean by the dead, or a man whose seed goeth from him. Wow. I don't think I've ever seen this part of the verse. I'm gonna have to look at this again. Like, if you need a case for semen retention, you have this here. Leviticus 18. You know, anytime the book of Leviticus comes up, you're gonna have some really explicit conversations. So 18:20, you shall not lie carnally, as opposed to non-carnally, with your neighbor's wife, to defile yourself. So here, this word it's translated here, to defile. And again, we're looking at this word, koite. Koite. And there's only 4 uses of it in the King James. Let's see where this comes in. Do not bother me. The door is now shut. My children are with me in bed. I cannot get up. In bed, because the word is for bed. It also just means straight up bed without all the extra connotations. We have Rebecca's conception. For some reason, I guess it would be similar to like the modern phrasing to bed someone. Let us walk properly. And this now in the ESV comes in as, is it sensuality or orgies? Which one is koite? Kind of curious about this. Let us behave as in the day, not in carousing, komos, drunkenness, mete koite. Interesting. You know, the King James says this is sexual promiscuity. The ESV calls this sexual immorality. They're running out of creativity. They don't have a separate translation for koite than they do for porneia. That's kind of odd. All right. I wonder if the other translations have a bit of a different take on this. So this is another feature of the Blue Letter Bible, is you can see a variety of translations. NKJV gives us the word lewdness, NLT, sexual promiscuity, NIV, sexual immorality, ESV, also very uncreative. CSB gets closer. They say sexual impurity. Interesting. Everyone else is like sexual promiscuity, which does not capture the intention put into this word, either here or in Hebrews. So we're going to drop back over to our list. There's one more place that this word shows up. It's so interesting how this word is scarcely used at all. The final place is here. Let the marriage bed be undefiled. So this is the idea of conception, right? This is the same word, to conceive children, and the marriage bed be undefiled. So this is about as explicit as they can get. We're not just talking marriage being held in honor, but let the conception be undefiled. What would defile this? We need to understand where the word defiled gets its meaning now. And that's partly where we're already looking back to the book of Leviticus to understand what makes something clean and unclean, what makes something defiled. We're going to check out the Greek word for this, which is amiantos. And Again, this is really interesting. It's only showing up 4 times in the New Testament. So when we have a word that is not often used, we don't have a lot of examples of it, it's harder to really pinpoint what that word means. As we did, we kind of danced around with the idea of marriage bed and conception. And at one point, it just means in bed. And at another point, it means impregnating. And so we have to kind of try to grasp the full range of meanings that are inherent in that Greek word, even without fully understanding the cultural context of that day. So here's what the word undefiled means, according to biblical usage here. Means unsoiled, free from that by which the nature of a thing is deformed or debased, or its force, vigor, impaired. Doesn't really help very much. All right. So back to Thayer's Greek lexicon. This was giving us some really interesting insights in the last word. This means not defiled, unsoiled, free from that. Okay. Again, not a very helpful thing. Pure, free from adultery is the meaning that they give to this word here in Hebrews 13. Without defect is the meaning they give it in 1 Peter 1:4. Thraiskia, also without defect. And then we have the idea of pure from sin in Hebrews 7. So we have, with these four appearances of this word, all seem to have very different meanings. 2 of them are in Hebrews. So let's see how the author uses it in Hebrews the first time. The first time he's talking about a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained. I think that's probably our word. High priest, holy, innocent, undefiled. And so the translators here use the word unstained when it's the same thing, undefiled. So what does this mean? We have to keep on seeking understanding here. And I think it's important to notice the surrounding words. We have holiness, we have innocence, we have separated, which is this idea of holiness, and exalted relates to honor. So there are 2 times that this word shows up. And this time, let the marriage bed be undefiled, unstained. Here, religion that is pure and undefiled, unstained, is this. What would make, so this is what we have to ask. If we have this idea of something being stained, that means something has arrived which is not supposed to be there. James 1:27. Purity and without stain. What would be not? Kind of asking this question. Someone who is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart. This person's religion is worthless. It's kind of the opposite here of religion that is pure and undefiled. Again, do you see these connections between these ideas, worthless versus precious, that we have back in Hebrews 13? Marriage is precious. Marriage bed, undefiled. Parallels here in the text. It's very interesting. To an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. So, if we're going to look just at this verse to explain what undefiled would mean, it could be defiled by either one of these 2 things, by porneia or by moicheia. And next week, we'll go into this idea of adultery a little bit more. Because for a woman to commit adultery meant having sex with a man who was not her partner. And remember, we saw this notion with Isaac. Rebecca conceived by one man, Isaac. And that was important for them to know, right? So porneia, which we've discussed in other places, I'm not going to go further into, but porneia can defile. And the marriage bed, if we're thinking about this, it means everything that we probably mean by it today. It has to do with the sexual relationship between people. So honoring the covenantal relationship and not letting the sexual relationship be stained by either one of these two things, which it could be stained by. So how does this apply to our question of polyamory in the Bible? This seems to be one of the most straightforward, if we consider adultery still at this point to be having sex with somebody you're not married to. It's very clear that this would defile the marriage for any one of the partners to have another sexual partner, or to break the covenantal expectations, which is the further meaning that I give to adultery from the teachings of Jesus. Porneia, on the other hand, brings in this idea that if a person's life and sexual expression is driven by their desire or instinct, without the ability to control that and use that to love another person, that would be defiling the marriage bed. So you kind of have these two angles. Sexual immorality is more on the individual angle. Adultery is more on the social angle. So either one of these things could defile the marriage bed. Now I want to go back and get a little bit of an understanding of how these things play into the Hebrew understanding. And to do this, I want to look at a story because we don't use this idea of defiled and undefiled very much. I'm also kind of curious that this word here for defiled only shows up 4 times in the New Testament. If you're a scholar and you have some deeper understanding of this, this is going to be an area that I have to look up a little bit more, because this idea of being defiled, amiantos, let's look at, it's a derivative of miano. Does this one show up more often? This one shows up 5 times. And this is where it gets the idea of staining, to dye, to stain, to pollute, potential ceremonial significance. And this is what I'm curious about, because back in the Old Testament, I wonder if the word comes in as defiled, or if defiled is very different from unclean. So something could be defiled. In the book of John, they couldn't enter the governor's headquarters or they would be defiled. Then you have the book of Titus, which is the passage I brought up once already, this idea of to the pure, all things are pure, but to the defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. Mind and conscience are defiled. Something is there that is not supposed to be there. It's been colored. It's been stained. See to it, no one fails to obtain the grace of God, because bitterness can defile someone. Then we have in Jude, we have people who rely on dreams and defile the flesh. So I think we're getting a bit of an understanding of this word. I want to look at the other word. Aha. So this is just the, looks like it's just the negative. So we're changing it from to defile to be undefiled. I want to do just a Google search, because it's interesting to me. This is challenging my conception of purity, impurity, clean, unclean, defiled, undefiled. And I'm curious if anybody has done research on, let's say, New Testament impurity. Let's just say purity versus unclean versus defiled. I probably should do Let's do impurity. And this will be more of a comparison of these three. Impurity. See, Google can be your friend if you're able to follow this down. So whoever wrote this, we're just glancing in at this, what the Bible says about defilement, they go straight to the word unclean, even though, as we're seeing here, defiled and unclean seem to be two different Greek words. Amiantos is undefiled. Let's see about this word for unclean. See if it shows up. This word shows up a lot of times in the ESV. This is where you get all this stuff from Leviticus. Notice our word for undefiled didn't show up in Leviticus. Like, that is really curious to me. So I'm curious where unclean enters the New Testament in contrast with defiled. Do you kind of see this connection that I'm trying to grab onto here? Language has capacity to be very general or very specific. And it's not always clear which way somebody is going to use something. Here, unclean, unclean, all the times it shows up in Matthew, in Mark, has to do with spirits. The word for unclean is used for spirits. Wow. The same word, or at least the English translation. Let's see what the Greek is for this. He commands the akatharta. Akatharsia has been a very interesting word study. Unclean, foul, not cleansed in a ceremonial sense or in a moral sense. But so far, we have all these unclean spirits, and we're typically not thinking this is something that belongs to a human being. Whereas the word defiled, which shows up along with sexuality, let's see if unclean shows up with sexuality anywhere here. It's all demonic spirits. That's amazing. Still in the book of Acts. And then Peter referring to food in the Old Testament. And then calling a person common or unclean. And then we looked at Romans 14 already a couple weeks ago. Nothing is unclean in itself. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. That's pretty close here. We have this idea of holiness versus uncleanness. And then we have touch no unclean thing. This seems to be a quote here in 2 Corinthians 6:17. Seems to be a quote from the Old Testament. And then you have more unclean spirits. So unclean seems to have to do more with spiritual reality. But then you also noticed when we were looking up the word defiled and looking at that lexicon, do you remember how many times they brought us back to the book of Leviticus to talk about clean versus unclean things? If we look at this in the Old Testament, this idea of clean versus unclean would have been very prominent in the thinking of the people who wrote the book of Hebrews or who read it. And this is the distinction between the holy and the common. So what is interesting to me in our Hebrews passage, and let's just drop back to Hebrews 13. The word that is used here is not holiness. Marriage is not about holiness or set apartness or ceremonial purity. It's about something that is honorable or precious or valuable. Marriage is valuable. So it's not saying marriage is holy, and the bed undefiled is not saying pure, not saying holy, not saying clean. I'm like, why did they use a different set of words here than were used in all of these other places? What is also interesting to me is that even though here in Leviticus, look at this, clean, unclean, like you become unclean from bearing a child. And if you didn't know, it's fascinating, but you had to offer a sin offering if you had a child, because it was apparently something that needed a sin offering. Diseases that spread, leprosy. And again, I read a very interesting research article on this that supposed a lot of what they were calling leprosy was actually STIs. It's very interesting. I had never heard this before, but a lot of it makes sense once you begin to study. There's all kinds of skin outbreaks that actually happen. And so that's why I thought coming into this study that there was going to be a really strong connection between clean and unclean, and then what we saw in the New Testament. But so far, I'm not finding this, which is fascinating to me. And so this is the passage we saw earlier. Anyone who touches the bed will wash the clothes and bathe himself in water, be unclean until the evening. The bed on which she lies. So there's something about the bed which is significant, but I think from what we saw in Hebrews, it seems to be more of a euphemistic use of the word. So in summary of what we found so far, and there's one more step I want to take in our study tonight. This idea of defiled means something stained, and porneia and moikeia contribute to that. The other thing is porneia and moikeia contribute to the honor or the value of marriage. So very interesting how these two things, they're separated. Marriage is treated separately from sexuality, but both of them can be deeply affected. So in other words, you could dishonor the marriage covenant, or you could defile the sexual relationship. And it was the same two activities that did both, porneia and moikeia. We're going to study moikeia a little bit more closely next week. Porneia, already studied that quite a lot. I will say if you want to understand that, I will say pick up my book. It's now available for sale, and you can get a printed copy, which is going to be absolutely amazing. They'll also just visit my website, sacrednotsinful.com. If you want to download a free sampler, easy way to get started, see if you like it, see if you hate it. Be curious to hear your thoughts. So that's my summary. Also, leave a comment if you have any insights or summary at this point. I'm curious to know what you would be thinking about. Let me pull this up a little bit further. All right. Next thing I want to look at is this idea of bed. Because remember, we're using this euphemistically in the New Testament, but we also kind of want to understand what's going on in the Old Testament. And I want to see if there's anything else related to sexuality that comes in relative to this word bed. So this is a place where somebody died, but it also potentially means staff. Very interesting. Okay, he didn't die yet. Sat up in bed. But look at this. This is why from last week I made the connection to this week, because of what Reuben did. This is the quote, right? So Jacob is dying. He gathers all of his children, and he thinks it's important to say this. He says, "You will not have preeminence because you went up to your father's bed and defiled it." He went up to my couch. So bed and couch are two of the meanings given to that word in the New Testament. Into the bed and breathed his last. So here it seems like it's being used both literally as in drawing your feet into the bed, and you went up to your father's bed and defiled it. What was it that defiled the bed? It was having sex with one of his wives. This was considered to be adultery. I don't know why he didn't say it was adultery. Why did he say it was something that defiled it? Also kind of curious what the Hebrew is for the word to defile and where else this comes in. Because remember, there is this distinction between clean and unclean, which seems to have a ceremonial significance, and then this idea of defiled, which shows up much more rarely. Okay, so then you defiled. We looked at this a little bit already, I think. I remember this word. To begin, profane, pollute. To wound. To profane, pollute ritually or sexually. Interesting. So there is a sexual connotation to this word defile. Let's look at let's look at the Septuagint translation of halal, defiled it. Do not know this well enough. Okay, let's open up Genesis 49:4 in the Septuagint. One of my Bible scholar friends taught me how to do this. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. So you can start to see where Septuagint. So you can start to see the connection between the Greek words and the Hebrew meaning. Can we see this here in the Blue Letter Bible? We can. Oh my goodness, I didn't even know that. All right, let's see. So we're here in 49:4, and we can change from this to, oh my goodness, I didn't even realize they had all of these in here. They even have the Latin. Wow. The things you learn. Okay, where do I find the Septuagint though? There it is. So what I want to see is if we have the same Greek word that we saw showing up for this. I think I noticed it. We have amenos, and we also have koite. Do you remember either one of these? We were looking at both koite and amenos earlier. This one, koite, is the word for bed, couch, and amenos is this connection to defiled. So whenever the Hebrews were translating, so the Septuagint, I believe, was created before Jesus showed up, actually. And the Jewish translators who were making this Greek variation, they would have tried to pick the Greek word that most closely matched the Hebrew meaning. And so that's why I wanted to look and see this word for defiled that we have in the New Testament is the word that they chose for this concept down here in the Old Testament. So there is a connection between this story here in Genesis 49 and the verses that we read in Hebrews. So what I'm curious about here, and look at it, like these are the stories both of Reuben and Simeon and Levi. All three of these guys lost their right of inheritance over something. Reuben did something sexual. Simeon and Levi did something with violence. They murdered a bunch of people. And we'll look at that in a minute as well. So what Reuben did in having sex with the concubine of Jacob defiled the marriage bed. So basically, because this woman belonged to Jacob, anybody else having sex with her would have defiled that sexual relationship. As you remember, the specific meaning to that word koite had to do with conception. What this means is that Jacob didn't know if it was his offspring or if it was Reuben's offspring. This was a problem. This was what defiling the marriage bed meant. You didn't know who the father was. And that was all important in the days of paternity, because in the patriarchal context, you would give your money, you would give your name, you basically considered yourself to be living on in the body of that child. And if it wasn't yours, so you can see why he was so incredibly upset with Reuben, because Reuben committed adultery. This is what the adulteration means. And this is, in fact, is very interesting. The definition of to adulterate that I give in this book is very similar to that. It's to introduce an unknown substance into something. And that changed then, from this point on, Jacob doesn't know if Bilhah, who is this concubine, has a child. Is it his or is it Reuben's? He doesn't know. That relationship is no longer something like it has been defiled. I'm curious because this doesn't fully explain what happened with David's concubines, but it does explain what is going on here and makes a link into Hebrews, right? So if a woman belongs to a man, it defiles that conception for somebody else to have sex with her. So now if we shift the whole context from a day in which the woman is the property of the man to a day when the woman is not the property of the man, how do we abstract our meaning? How do we abstract what we have to learn from the text to apply to a cultural context in which now a woman is considered to have her own sexual agency? The difference between negative 4,000 or negative 2,000, which is probably when this is happening, 2,500 BC, more or less, and then the years of Jesus and shortly after when the New Testament is written, so around 0, both of those contexts, the Greek and the Hebrew relationship with women was incredibly oppressive, as we saw with the stories of both the concubines and the virgins. The father was like, here, rape them instead of my male guests. Now, both of those examples were really terrible cities and things that shouldn't have happened. But even so, you can understand the position of women in that day. Something changes in the New Testament. What changes? We have to understand that. So here's our first example. The next example that I want to look at, and let me go and I want to see what are some other examples of, next verse, this word defiled, where else this shows up in the Old Testament, and what other examples of sexuality we can find relative to it. I thought we were going to look at clean and unclean and spend more time in Leviticus, but maybe we'll be spending our time here. All right. This word has a lot of meanings. Notice how many times it comes in: to begin, to profane, to pollute, to defile. Let's just look up the 9 times when it's translated as defile. So we're restricting our study remember, this word has many more meanings than this, but I also want to see where the translators decided they should use the word defile. First use here is with Reuben. The next use is with the Sabbath day. Everyone who works on the Sabbath day defiles it. Whoever defiles the holiness of the Sabbath day will be put to death. All right. For anyone who does any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement right there, isn't it? If I were to come home and be like, all right, everybody who works on Sunday needs to be put to death. Wow. And that soul is probably the word nefesh. I'm curious as to why they use the word soul will be cut off. I think because the soul was considered to move through the family line. And this idea of being cut off refers to castration in a physical sense or in a spiritual, like genealogical sense. Karat. No, it's a very long one. So it also has very practical meanings. Where is it? The soul, nefesh. Why did they use soul? Soul, life, person, mind, heart, creature. So there's some particular meanings. I'm not going to dive too deeply into that. Still, working off of this idea to defile. Another thing that can be defiled. The Sabbath day can be defiled. The sanctuary can be defiled. And again, being cut off is the consequence. Because, very interesting, he is given of his seed unto Molech. There wasn't a huge distinction made here between living human beings and potentially living human beings. This concept of seed applies to born children as well as to unborn, unconceived. My goodness. All right. This person will be cut off from the people because he is given of his seed to Molech. Zerah. And this has to do with just regular seeds like sowing seeds, also has to do then with the male seed. All right. And look, this is a really interesting use of this term because Eve says that God has appointed her another seed instead of Abel. Wow. That's so interesting. But this does connect in with the primary purpose that we see through the Old Testament. This focus of everyone throughout this Old Testament is on having children. And even the marriage relationship, the ownership of women was all about procreation. It was all about, we need to continue the family line. We need to have more children. This was an all-important focus. So whenever we're talking about marriage relationships, we are talking about that. Now, in terms of either wives or concubines, yes, this applies. When it comes to things like prostitution, not so much. So here, defiles. The chief people should not defile or profane themselves. Defile and profane seem to be. It's very interesting how these two are used together twice in Leviticus. Defiling the sanctuary through, it seems to be something sexual or at least something generational here. First Chronicles. So interesting. Reuben was the firstborn of Israel. but because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright. So to defile the bed is a big deal in this time here. Okay. Fire into the sanctuary they have defiled by casting down the dwelling place to the ground. Okay. Defiled the land with carcasses of detestable and abominable things. So this is related to the word unclean now. It's very interesting to me to note, like, the primary example that we have of this is Reuben. Never thought he was going to come up so much in a conversation. Then we have holy places being defiled. We have defiling the sanctuary, profaning the Sabbath. So sanctuary, Sabbath. Defile thy brightness. Okay. Defile the sanctuaries with iniquity. And those were all the 12 verses that where halal was translated by the King James, or by the ESV, it seems. No, King James, as the word defile. Now, this also means to pollute or to profane. Let's look at to profane and see what comes in here. Because I think profaned can be a number of other things. You can profane the name. Again, this is letting the seed pass through the fire to Molech. Everyone that eats it has profaned, so this is probably eating of the holy things. Profaning the name of God by swearing falsely. Defiling the sanctuary, profaning the holy name, profane himself. They shall be holy to their God and not profane the name. So profane versus holy is made here. Now, the daughter of a priest could profane herself through prostitution. And by doing this, she profanes her father. So this is a very specific thing. There were some special rules for the priests about their sexual behavior, like who they were allowed to marry and not marry as well. And this shows that if somebody defiles themselves by playing the whore, so they're pretending to be a prostitute, right? While she is in her father's house, and her father is a priest, she shall be burnt with fire. The other example that we have of that is when Judah has sex with his daughter-in-law, and when he finds out, he says, well, she should be burnt with fire. Fascinating to me that there is no reciprocal thing. If the son of any priest, if he profane himself by playing the whore, he profanes his father and shall be burnt with fire. It was only the girl who could do it. The guy here could profane his seed. And let's go to Leviticus 21, because this has so many uses of the word to defile. It's amazing. So again, these are the special instructions for the priests. Regulations concerning the priests. So this was a particular bloodline of people, and they had to preserve that bloodline, because only the people who could trace their genealogy to the children of Aaron would be eligible to enter the temple. So we've got to keep this in mind. This is very important for the priestly line to be only the priestly line, right? You can defile yourself by touching something dead, all of these things. They shall be holy and not profane the name of God. So here, they shall not take a wife that is a whore or profane. Either one of the two are out. Neither shall they take a woman put away from her husband, for he is holy unto his God. So the priestly line, you'll see in verse 8, I believe. No. In some place, it says that he is only allowed to marry a virgin. He shall take a wife in her virginity. So basically a young woman who, let's see what this word is. Yeah. This isn't going to quite work, but basically a young woman. So someone who has never had sex with another person is very important. This whole chapter seems to be about that, right? If you're part of the priestly line and you're a male, you cannot bring in a female who has ever had sex with somebody who is not of the priestly line or not you, which is very interesting. So there is why somebody answer this if you have the question, but why is this only for the daughter of the priest? Like, I don't understand. She profanes her father. Right? What is going on here? Like, ritual defilement would happen for family members, but the priestly line was not allowed to do that. Then this one. This is very an interesting verse given what we're studying right now. Neither shall he profane his seed among his people. Among his people. Huh. So this may be one of the first regulations for male sexuality that I have seen in the Old Testament. I mean, besides don't have sex with a woman who belongs to another man. Why? Because I, the Lord, sanctify him. His own people. So referring to his people, I believe here is referring to people who are also of the priestly line. So to profane his seed among his people. That's amazing. I'm just thinking about this because there's two ways to pull this into the New Testament because we are all part of that priestly line now, right? So this is about as close as you get to some sort of biblical proposition for virginity until marriage for women and avoiding profaning. And to profane means to defile. I don't like. You can see I'm seeking a deep understanding of this. I want to know what it means to halal this. What does it mean to profane his seed? I haven't seen any other examples of this. I've seen this idea that you can profane, pollute, defile. But I haven't seen this being said for like to pierce, to wound, to like this seems to be to misuse, but the actual translation of this word of to pollute or defile or to introduce something to that doesn't belong there. It's an interesting use of the word because just speaking in graphic sexual terms, you can understand how the idea of defiled or introducing some new substance works in terms of male to female. But in terms of this, what would this mean to profane his seed among his people? which is different than to, remember, we saw how someone could offer the seed to Molech or make the seed pass through the fire. And whether that was born children or whether that was just bodily fluids, it's hard to say. Wow. But then we look at this. Neither shall he profane his. What if we looked at seed as the word children? Shall he profane his children? Because again, we have this word, whoever he be of thy seed, and this is meaning generations. Let me see what they, this CSB, I've become curious about this translation recently. He must not leave the sanctuary or he will desecrate. So they pull the word defiled by prostitution. A woman could be defiled by prostitution. So they connect verse 15 to verse 14. He is to marry a virgin from his own people so that he does not corrupt his bloodline. So it is, in this case, it seems referring to children. But notice how they put the footnote, because it's not clearly saying that. It's literally not profane his seed. So what does that mean? Basically, you cannot introduce blood from outside of the bloodline into the priestly line. You cannot marry outside of your close family. For I am the Lord who sets him apart. Wow, I mean, this is such a helpful translation for understanding this. Did you see how, like, just looking at this in the CSB unlocked it more? That was great. We also need to understand, though. So Leviticus 21, yay. This is making a really strong case for female virginity. We have this idea of, again, do you know, this is weird, because we have, if a priest's daughter defiles herself by prostitution, she must be burned to death. But then over here, there were apparently a number who had. So another priest was not allowed to marry her if she had done that. Do you see how these two verses are a little bit antithetical? There shouldn't have been any of them that existed if they were burning them all with fire. Which I'm sort of happy that that doesn't seem to be happening. But at the same time, you're understanding just the drastic nature of what's going on here. And the whole point, so that when you go through all of this and you're like, okay, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, so that you find out the whole reason, the logic, the rationale. You have to preserve the bloodline. And this lines up with what we know of the importance of the text all the way through. This focus on the descendants. But if we are going to pull this from the Old Testament into the New Testament, and we're like, all right, let's grab this sexual standard. We're all of the priestly line now. We get to this next section where nobody who has a disability is allowed to come into the presence of God. He can eat the food, but he cannot be part of the ministry. If you have any kind of physical defect, you are not allowed to function as a minister of God. And this is Leviticus chapter 21. These two parts go together. We don't get to dive into Leviticus and we're like, all right, I'm taking verses 5, 6, and 7, and the rest of them, we're like, we're not dealing with those. We have to understand the whole thing all at once. And if you followed me to this point, I'm suspecting you're as equally, what shall we say, unclear as I am about what we're supposed to take away from this. This is the point where I'm like, all right, we get to spend a lot of time unpacking the law. If you've ever read Psalms 119, it talks so much about studying the law. This is what we've been doing. We've been studying the law, seeking to understand something about God. And sometimes you dive in over your head. And you're like, what's going on here? And you have to realize it's maybe a bit of a longer journey than you thought. So I want to finish going through this Old Testament use of the word defiled. I'm trying to get back to this list here. We're still in the Leviticus list. Come on. All right. So this is the list of the times when halal is translated as profane. And we dove into 21 because Leviticus 21 had this a lot. Looks like Leviticus 22 also has it a lot, all about profaning holy things. So holy things can be profaned. Then it's not translated that way until Nehemiah. Profaning the Sabbath day. We already know that that's possible. Profaning a crown by casting it to the ground. Profaning the princes of the sanctuary. Her priests have violated my law, have profaned the holy things. They put no difference between the holy and profane. So we have profane, which is put into opposition of holiness here. So defiled, remember, all of this is about the New Testament context for this passage in Hebrews. And that is this idea of defiled or profaned would have had as its opposite or counterpart holiness, a little bit. The word for unclean would have had holiness as its counterpart a lot. Because even as we use in our phrasing, the Holy Spirit is opposite of the unclean spirits. These two things are opposites. Unclean is different than defiled. But there's still a little bit of connection. Defiling the sanctuary, profaning the Sabbath. This is in the book of Ezekiel. We saw a number of examples there. Okay, very interesting. Amos 2:7. This one looks interesting. What is this about? This is a judgment on Judah and Israel, but this starts talking for 3 transgressions of Judah and for 4. I will not turn away the punishment. I will send a fire upon them. Why? Because they sold the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of shoes. That pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor. This is odd. I do not understand what this means. Let's go switch our translation and see if that is helpful at all. They trample the heads of the poor on the dust of the ground. That is much more clear. They're selling righteous people. So we have some slave trade, we have oppression of the poor, and then we have this. Amos 2:7, a man and his father have sexual relations with the same girl. Which does what? Profaning my holy name. That's incredible. Look at that connection. Like, this is why I love tracking down some of these words, because we get such interesting examples. And his father, resort to, is the Hebrew term here. To go, to come, to depart. Okay, so potentially euphemistically used as a sexual relationship. And that is what the translators decided to do. But then you have what? In order to profane my holy name. They stretch out beside every altar on garments taken as collateral. So this is the idea of a sexual immorality in worship of these gods. And in the house of their god, they drink wine obtained through fines. Wow. So that's amazing. I was like, this example, I've not come across this before. This is why I enjoy these studies so much. It's just like coming in and finding out all of these just little examples, pictures, contexts, seeking to understand something. And why this says profaning my holy name could be connected to this, that they are intentionally doing this in order to worship another god. So quite likely this imagery is that they are coming to the same temple prostitute, profaning my holy name. This has to do with the reputation of God. This would refer to the idea in the New Testament as porneia. It's interesting, though, that they're saying what is profaned by this is the holy name of God. That's what I'm most fascinated by, is that there is something that they do sexually, which we've heard about this, the man and his father. This is the story of Reuben, which is to defile the couch, but I don't think it's that. I think it has to do with, because see, what was profaned here was not the marriage bed. What was profaned here was God's holy name. They stretch out beside every altar on garments taken as collateral. So this financial, economic oppression has in the center of it two things. It looks as though it's ceremonial prostitution because they're stretching out beside every altar. This is a sexual connotation. I wonder if it always is, or if it's also like one of those to stretch out, to bow down, to turn aside. We've seen a lot of these things with a sexual euphemism. Let's see if they are recognizing that here. Not at first glance. Okay. Set out, settled. All right. No, it has a much broader meaning. But here in this context, this is what it appears to be. And we have to ask the question now. May not be an either or, but what is it that profanes the holy name? Was it the fact of not following Leviticus chapter 18? But that's so interesting. I wonder what the word is used here for girl. Turn away, resort to the same na'ara. Damsel, maiden, young woman. And then they say concubine or prostitute as potential side meanings. All right. Very interesting. Well, it's been about 90 minutes of study. I feel like there's more, but I also feel like I've sort of exhausted this path for now. At least in terms of my understanding, found some very interesting things. This verse in Amos 2. Probably going to go back and read the whole book of Amos tomorrow. I'm quite curious about that. This is the word profane. I think that was almost the last example of profaned. The table of the Lord is polluted, profaned the holiness of the Lord, and has married the daughter of a strange god. So here, this use in Malachi can help us understand the use in Amos. And this is, I wonder if it's entirely, I don't think it's entirely allegorical. I think this is symbolic, religiously symbolic, but this idea of marrying the daughter of a strange god means to be very closely connected to join oneself to the daughter of a strange god. So this would have to do with the priests. Remember, the priests were not allowed to marry outside of the priestly line. So they are marrying outside of the priestly line, out of the tabernacles, and him that offers an offering to the Lord. Yeah. So this is speaking about the priestly line here. And they're marrying not just outside of the priestly line, they're marrying priestesses of foreign gods. This is profaning the covenant of the fathers, profaning the holiness of the Lord. And so likely that is what is being referred to in Amos as well. That's it for that word. There's one more word. I don't know. Do I want to push it a little bit further? We looked at profane, we looked at defile. Let's glance at this third translation. So we've spent our time looking at the word defile in the New Testament and this word halal in the Old Testament. That's been the real emphasis of the study, because we're trying to understand what it means to defile something. We need to understand what that word can teach us about porneia and moikeia. And the easy thing to do, and this is a temptation for me, as it is probably for anyone who does this, is to be like, well, yeah, obviously it means this, and that, these things that today we think defile that. What we're trying to do, and why we spent almost 2 hours on this, is we're trying to understand what is the meaning that is inherent in the text. Granted, this is probably what preachers do in their spare time, right? This is sermon preparation. And one day I'll actually be teaching this, but the benefit of Sunday night school is A, that you get to jump in on the conversation, and B, that you get to witness the whole thing. And it's honestly a little bit vulnerable at times, because I don't know. You're watching me in this process of repentance, which means to change your mind, to come into the text and be open to what it says, to be curious about it, to follow it in all the directions that it goes. So this last bit, looking at polluting something, polluting holy things, mine inheritance, and how did that happen? Because this was the key. The altar cannot be made of hewn stone, because if you put a tool upon it, you have polluted it. Polluting the name. Okay. Very interesting. Polluting the name, polluting the kingdom, the secret place, me. So a lot of the times this was translated by the King James as polluted had to do with the name of God. Again, let's take a look at these in the CSB and see if we get some interesting. It's only translated this way once in that version. Interesting. So the land can be polluted. The name can be polluted. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary. The table of the Lord. Okay. This one here. So how could something be polluted? If you brought into the sanctuary strangers, uncircumcised people have been brought into the sanctuary, that polluted it. Okay. Hearts going after idols. This one is the last one I think that catches my attention here. But you turned and polluted my name and caused every man his servant, every man his handmaid, whom you had set at liberty at their pleasure to return. So this was, you had freed these people and then you went and then forced them to be your servants again. And subjected them. So pollution through, again, economic oppression. You know what's kind of interesting to me, and I'm going to stop the share. I feel like that's a pretty thorough exploration of this idea. I feel a little bit tired as well. What I'm intrigued by, though, in the Old Testament is that these words to pollute, to defile, to profane, applies most often not to something sexual, but to something economic. Right? The New Testament, we had just 4 examples of this word, meaning something very specific, relatively. It's kind of hard. It meant 4 very different things, but there's some common factor that brings them all together in the understanding of that day. But the Old Testament, how much of a focus is there on economics as being things that pollute the land, the sanctuary, the Sabbath, to profane? And then we have a couple of really focused chapters on here's what the priests are and are not allowed to do that are explicitly referring to sexual things. So based on this, kind of trying to let my mind grab hold of all of these ideas at once and channel them into something. No, I haven't got any really profound conclusions at this point. I have a lot of stirring ideas because some of what we picked up in the Old Testament and then some of that meaning and significance we found in the New Testament is very interesting. I'm also curious. There is the story of Jacob's daughter who was humiliated by her lover. That's another thing that I'm kind of curious about to explore. I think I'll drop into that next time because we're going to look more at the idea of premarital sex in the Old Testament and kind of see what that's all about. The adultery portion, we will also touch somewhat on that, but that ties in, again, both of these things, as we saw also tonight. There's a very different standard for men than there was for women throughout the Old Testament. In the New Testament, you see a lot more equality or equalization of men and women. All are free, all are equal, all are brothers and sisters, as opposed to the master-slave kind of relationship that we saw in the concubine scenario last week. So given that something changes in the New Testament, we have to understand what is at the heart of the Old Testament teaching in order to understand and apply the New Testament teaching to our lives. Maybe that's the only thing you get out of this whole study. I feel like tonight was data collection, information gathering. And if you stuck around for it and are fascinated by it, I love how much you care about the text. If you dropped off part way, I can totally understand that as well. I think next week we're gonna move through a little bit more quickly, but this was a very intensive study of a couple of words, trying to grab some cultural context. And I learned, like when you learn so much new stuff, when you get so much new information, it's hard to process it into something, and that's kind of how I'm feeling now. A little bit of information overload. But yeah, would love to hear again how some of this has hit you, what really stands out, and we'll see what we can build on this next time when we dive back into the study. So to wrap up, my book is out. I would so love for you to buy a copy and find out what's inside, because A New Christian Sexual Ethic is a key to freedom, not just in terms of sexuality, but in terms of ethics, the relationship with God, what it looks like to be holy, to live as a Christian in a way that's different than the rest of the world, not just by adding on a couple of extra things that we do and don't do, but by changing the way that we understand who we are, how we show up in the world, how we show up in our sexuality and our sexual relationships. So if you're curious to know more about that, you can find details at sacrednotsinful.com. You can also connect with me at drkevinjensen.com if you would like to invite me to lead a study, hopefully a little bit more interesting than this. I also have a number of prepared sessions that I have for leading through teenagers, youth group gatherings, marriage conference workshops, or any number of occasions. So contact me if you're curious to open this conversation about ethics and morality from a Christian perspective, and having this conversation, this dialogue in a way that is successful, because a lot of times we're speaking a different language inside of the church than people are speaking outside of the church. And we have to know how to come together and communicate without simply shouting at each other and being unable to show the love of God in our conversations. So if you want some help with that, definitely reach out. I have a form on my website you can enter. If you need some personal support or want to process through any of these things, reach out on a personal basis, send me a message. And if you have a question that you want to add into this series on polyamory and the Bible, I would love to hear it, because we're going deep on a couple of things, but we're starting at my points of awareness. And you'll probably recognize that. Maybe some of it's a little further than how far you've explored. Maybe some of it is you're like, well, I've already looked at this and have a great conclusion. Send me what you're thinking. Either way, would love to know more of your perspective. And be sure to join us next time, again, next week, every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be going live. And this is honestly a whole lot more fun when there's more of us looking at the text. So would love to have you here live with all of your questions and observations. But until next time, peace.